I'm just getting used to the idea that two very, very bright eyes are staring at me from up here, and I can't see any of you. So I will, I much prefer talking to an audience in an informal setting where I can just see all your faces and recognize you. But nonetheless, the all-seeing eye of the video camera is going to dominate this tonight. As some of you know from some of the talks that I've done at Carol's studio, I'm an astronomer who, in some sense, went astray in the early 1970s after taking a trip down to Mexico City to the National Museum of Anthropology there and some of the famous archaeological sites. And I guess as somebody who, went through a very stiff physical science education, I began to realize only in graduate school that I was not getting everything that I was looking for out of that aspect of life. And apparently at the right time, I ran into the world of ancient America and pre-Columbian art, and it really has had a profound effect on my life. And what I'd like to do tonight is share some of my feelings and inspirations about this, as well as give you an introduction to at least one type of pre-Columbian art, namely the art of the classic Maya civilization of ancient Mesoamerica. Now the slides will proceed in sort of dual projection format here, and starting off with two maps. This is the Maya area of ancient Mesoamerica, part of Mexico and Guatemala, the little country of Belize, formerly British Honduras, and Honduras and El Salvador is the region that a brilliant civilization arose in the early centuries of our era. And it certainly dominated the cultures of the Americas for the better part of a millennium. A brilliant civilization. While the Western world was wallowing in the Dark Ages, the Maya flourished. They were contemporaries with the famous Tang Dynasty in China. Again, the great medieval fluorescence of Chinese culture. There are many comparisons that are useful. Their rise began slowly, beginning about 600 BC in the central lowland jungles of Mexico and Guatemala. And at first they were simple corn farmers. Could I have the next two slides? Corn is literally what powered and what created the ancient cultures of the North America. Corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, certain cactus and agave products were indigenous plants, and it's what fed the rise of this civilization. So the first people, this is a newly discovered mural from a highland Mexican site called Cacaxtla. It's in pure Maya style and shows the Maya maize god, because again, as Octavio Paz would tell you, the Mexican people, the Maya people, are men of maize, and in their mythology they were formed from the maize plant themselves. I even think that perhaps some of their head binding techniques that produced a head this shape, you'll see it later on in the arts, was actually an attempt to look like an ear of corn, the corn heads as it were. You can meditate on that as we go along. So in 600 BC or so, in the central lowlands, we had the first Maya people clearing the jungles and beginning to grow corn and beans and these plants in what is called slash and burn agriculture. The next two slides. It's a very simple but powerful technique that involves clearing the jungle, burning it, planting a crop of corns and beans and squash, which complement each other. It gives one a full protein diet and is very rich, but it's not very land efficient. And so the population was quite dispersed. But as they went along, next slides, we know that they began to develop intensive agricultural techniques, something that the highland Mexicans would have called chinampa agriculture. It's raised fields. Now, Just a moment. The collapse of the Maya. I hope the television got that. So anyway, it's now in a little groove up there, and I don't know whether it was just sort of balancing on the edge waiting for that moment. What you're seeing here is over on the right are these raised fields as they appear today up in Highland, Mexico. And this is an aerial photo of some ancient Maya raised fields in an area of Belize. So we now, in some sense, have solved a good part of the mystery of the success of the Maya. How did a civilization start in the lowland jungles of Central America? It had been a mystery up until the last 10 or so years. We now know that they practiced an intensive agricultural technique that was very successful and could feed the people and really caused a great boom, a great rise in civilization. One always has to ask what it is that allows, why was there a civilization here, for example, and nothing really in North America to parallel it? And I think the answer is corn agriculture developed very early on. In time, this would have spread up to North America. Perhaps the Mississippi and Ohio valleys might have had something similar. Next two slides. This allowed them to build one of the most brilliant civilizations of the ancient world, a fully literate culture, because the Maya developed one of the 5 primary writing systems of the ancient world. You probably all know about the Sumerians and Babylonians in the Fertile Crescent, the Egyptians, China, the Indus Valley, and the Maya developed the first major writing systems. So they built pyramids, temples, great cities in the jungle, and erected these statues and stone monuments that are called stelae to their rulers. Now, if someone were giving a lecture like this 30 or 40 years ago, they would say that the Maya were a pacific, contemplative people, astronomer priests, sitting out in their centers, contemplating time itself. We now know that they were warlike city-states. They were constantly warring and vying amongst each other for territory and for prestige. We also know that these monuments, which would have been claimed to have been monuments to time itself and the calendar, we now know are dynastic monuments, and the individuals that you're seeing here are they're portraits of specific Maya rulers. This one is called, well, we call him 18 Jog or 18 Rabbit of Copan, the 13th ruler of Copan. So it contains history as well as the mythological charter for the rule of the Maya. So we now have a historical perspective on these people. Next. But again, with their rise to civilization in the early centuries of our era, by about the 8th and 9th century AD, something went disastrously wrong with the lowland Maya. It was such a disaster, in a sense, that they never recovered from it. The civilization in the lowlands fell, was overgrown by jungle, and it never recovered. The jungle claimed it, and the population dropped to almost zero, and it remained that way up until today, when logging companies are going in for the first time and beginning to occupy, I should say logging companies and tourists are going in to occupy this territory. It's one of those things that if you are a real estate investor, you really lost your shirt back in about 800 and 900 AD in this region, because you'd have to wait more than 1,000 years for the land to begin to be worth something again. So we're left with this mystery of the lost cities of the jungle, this being Tikal in the central lowlands. Okay, next. So what I'd like to do is show you through their art some things that we've learned in recent years about the Maya, about their rise, about their greatness, and about their eventual fall. And perhaps, without belaboring it too much, I'd like you to try to see some lessons in their civilization that we might apply to our own situation today. So, who were these people? These are portraits of Maya elites from Yaxchilan and Palenque. What can we learn about them? Next. The Maya people are still alive. Their descendants live in Yucatan, in Belize, in the highlands of Guatemala, and still possess an extremely rich culture. They've lost the highest levels of their civilization. They no longer keep the calendar in its elaborate form, but being very conservative and in many cases isolated people, speaking in many cases only a Maya dialect. There are something like 30 surviving Maya languages and more than 2 million speakers. That they still possess many of the cultural traits of their ancestors. Next. One of the least acculturated groups are the Lacandon Maya of Chiapas. They are the only group that did not nominally adopt Catholicism, so they still practice a Maya or a native variety of religion. This is old Chanquin from Nahach here in his god house, feeding the god pots. Next. Things are changing. Some people up in the Guatemalan highlands still wear the native costume, but particularly among men, this is now changing, and they're adopting Western ways. Next. Technology is making inroads. This is one of my favorite pictures from Chamula with the kids in their native garb discovering a Volkswagen. And these young Maya are wearing strictly modern clothes. So this is something that, of course, is happening all over the world. We're going to have to look quick if we're going to learn from these people about the ancient ways before it's completely gone. Next. Does she? I didn't think she had a huipil on. Okay. They're very religious people. Nominally, most of them are Catholic, but when you look into it carefully, as here at Chichicastenango, the religion is very much a Native American religion, and the Catholicism is a thin veneer. The ancient gods are now called saints or santos, and that many times the dates that they worship these gods are the dates that the ancient gods were worshipped. Next. The practices are alive. Modern Maya will go out into a cane field to an ancient ruin like here in the El Baúl area of Guatemala and still make offerings of candles, of tobacco, of alcohol, of chocolate, and incense, as their ancestors did. Next. The contemporary Maya also still, in general, live in the indigenous manner. The picture on the right is a contemporary Yucatecan house. And as you can see from this model of a house on a facade from Uxmal in northern Yucatan, things haven't changed in 1,000 years. The indigenous house is still the same. Very conservative people. They learned how to live, and they have continued to live that way. Next. Archaeologically, we can follow their rise, again from about 600 BC, as simple farmers living in houses like that. And particularly in the early centuries of this era, the chiefdoms expanded into states, separate states ruled by dynastic families. And certain houses were singled out and raised on larger and larger platforms, higher stepped platforms. And this became the stepped temple pyramid of the ancient Maya. Tikal Temple 1 here on your left is an ancestral hall, a dynastic monument. It's a tomb for a very important Maya ruler. So it's a place where these rulers were worshipped, and we know that sometime in the early centuries again, 200, 300 AD, the art changes from images of the faces of the gods themselves on many of these buildings in the forms of large masks to portraits of the rulers themselves, and they become deified. A recent decipherment of title of these Maya lords indicates that they are calling themselves literally divine lords, Chulahau, divine lord. And some of them certainly embodied the qualities of the planets, and in many cases the sun. Next. So archaeologically we can follow their rise. So I'm going to go through a section here where we look at the different types of media that they worked in for their arts, because certainly their art, as part of the archaeological record, is one of the main sources that we have to learn about them. They've left us these types of images. On the right are some figurines from the Haina Island funerary complex showing elite Maya. And some of them are gods, but most of them are actually portraits of people. And this artist here did a reconstruction, which actually is not too bad, of how the classic Maya elite would have looked. The only thing that's really wrong with the picture on the left is that the buildings would have been quite brilliantly painted. Most Maya buildings were bright, red, a red barn red, iron oxide red, with lots of blues, greens, yellows, and blacks and whites on them. So with that exception, this is probably a fairly good portrayal. Next. Much of what we now know about them comes from the fact that they were literate, that they had a full hieroglyphic writing system, and they wrote in books, on carved stone monuments, in murals, on pottery. They wrote on everything. And these texts are beginning to be read. This is called a stela, a large standing stone monument, which again we now know in general contains historical information. There are two Maya lords here, one of them the ruler, standing on a hieroglyphic text, and below are two bound captives. We find that the Maya were highly warlike, and one of the things that they loved to do in their art was show their authority by displaying bound captives. Things haven't changed very much in some sense, I suppose. The texts often are quite mundane in what they discuss. They talk about births, deaths, accessions to kingship, marriages, alliances, and various heir designation ceremonies and anniversaries of all these things, because they were interested in placing the events of importance in their lives in a grand cosmic framework. The world's most elaborate calendar. Having studied calendars, no people of the ancient world developed a more elaborate calendar than the classic Maya. It has so many parts, it would take me a half an hour just to begin to tell you the different sides of it. But at the roots of it was a grand cycle, something called 13 Baktuns, where a Baktun is about 400 years. So one of their grandest cycles was about 5,125 years or so, broken up into units of 20 years called Katuns. Their calendar, we now know, began in a day in August in 3114 BC. It was a time projected back, very much, say, like the Jewish or Hebrew calendar, which is projected back to the creation of the world. And the great cycle of 13 Baktuns comes to an end around the winter solstice in the year 2012, just coming up. The classic Maya never lived to see the end of their great calendar. They lived in what was called Baktun 8 and Baktun 9. But their great cycle is going to come to an end shortly, again, in a little over 20 years. And the last 20-year period of time begins in April of 1993. So personally, I'm taking some interest in noting their great passage of time, thinking about how they would have looked at our world today, living at this time, watching the end of a cycle that would have involved a destruction of the world and a new creation. And I'm also interested in using this as a metaphor for looking back and trying to understand from our point of view what happened to them. Okay, next slides. They also wrote in books. Books of bark paper painted with a plaster gesso and inscribed with probably a turkey feather pen. We're not quite sure what type of pen they used. 17 or so books have survived from ancient Mesoamerica, only 4 of them Maya. What a tragedy to think of a culture this rich. They had grand libraries and thousands of books, and only 4 Maya books have survived. Next. But it's a source of information about these people. They also painted in murals. Now these are recreations, actually, of the famous Bonampak murals, but we can learn something from these. Next. I'm showing you sources of information now. Pottery. This is a rollout photograph here of a Maya vase, and there's another Maya vase. These vases that we think, well, we know that they were placed in tombs, and I believe that they actually are mortuary furnishings, that they were created to go into the tombs rather than simply being eliteware that sat around on their mantelpieces, as it were, and then incidentally were placed with the great lords in the tomb. One of the new discoveries involves their word for writing, and the person in the right-hand vase there is a scribe. You're looking at the image of a Maya scribe who is painting a face, a mask. And right above his head is the word to write, tsib, spelled phonetically. Because we now know that Maya writing was part ideographic and part phonetic. We know that the Maya could write anything they wanted to in a purely phonetic form, but they often chose, for poetic reasons, to use a partially ideographic and partially phonetic script. It's something that interests me a great deal, and perhaps conversations afterwards I could talk to you if you're interested in the nature of their writing system. Next. This is the god of scribes, the monkey man god. He was a howler monkey man, and there are many legends about this character, but he's the artist. Because in our classification, I suppose you would separate an artist from a scribe. In their culture, it was the same person, and they painted the murals, and they painted the vessels. And again, a recent discovery, it's David Stewart that discovered this, is that many Maya monuments and some of these vessels are signed by the artist. Now again, even 5 years ago, the standard wisdom was that there were no signatures in Maya art, but we now know that there are. So here's the monkey man god writing in a jaguar skin covered codex book. And there he is over there holding his ink pot and his pen. Next. So you're looking at the ancient American artist. I worked on some of these pieces. These are ink pots. That's the bottom of a bowl over there in the form of the face of the monkey man scribe. Isn't that a powerful face? The god of the arts. And here in the form of a paint pot is this same monkey man. I think there's a good chance that those teeth were used as a brush holder. Next. So they documented much of elite life in these vases, and so we find it's almost like looking at photographs of courtly life, and you have to just look at the faces on these people and imagine them the big politicians of the just Rostenkowski or just whoever else here. Next slides. Jade was one of their most precious substances. I'll correct that and say it was the most precious substance. The great areas of the world where jade was worked was ancient China and Southeast Asia and Mesoamerica and Costa Rica. And the Maya were masters of jade carving. There you see a plaque again with a Maya lord sitting there with his dwarf. And here are two little emblems, a character that we call the jester god. For something to call it, we now know it represents the concept of being a lord and a how. So these were actually costume ornaments saying, that would have been worn by a great lord. Next. More jade. The one on the left is a portrait of an individual wearing a specific variety of sun god mask helmet. On the right is a portrait of a god, the Maya sun god. So they're both gods and men depicted in jade carving. Next. And again, ceramics. And I strongly argue that these ceramics were used for a funerary function, and at this point, again, it's just the last few years that we found of what they put in them. And this particular Maya cylinder here held cacao. That's the bean from which chocolate comes, from which our word cocoa comes. So I probably can't move from this area to show you, but, well, actually, that glyph right there says cacao. It's the personified form of cacao. So some of these can be read, and one of the interesting discoveries was that a vase with a sort of a lock top said that it contained two types of cacao, and it was sent to the laboratory, actually the Hershey laboratories in Pennsylvania, oddly enough, and it did turn out to be cacao. This is an interesting published paper. So it contained what it said it did. Next. Figurines, lots of figurines. With this one decorated, you can still see some of the Maya blue, a very interesting kind of color. Some of these almost take on a portrait quality. Some of them are very simple mold-made figures, but a young man and someone dressed as a warrior in an elaborate costume. Next. Finally, I want to emphasize that with the Maya, we have true portraiture. In many other early cultures, you don't get very much portraiture. You get stylized figures of one sort or another, whether they are gods or men. But the Maya give us portraits, and faces like this, I think, can speak to us across time. In some cases, we have the specific named individual. We know who he is, we see what he looked like as a young man, maybe even as a child, as a mature adult, as an old man, and you can see that it's the same person. This is something, again, that's a relatively recent realization in Maya studies. Next. A note about women. Women in Maya society, and again, I want to indicate that during the classic period, we know that it was a very hierarchical society. There was certainly the average person, there were merchant guilds, there were artisans, but then there was probably a fairly distinct boundary with the elites who claimed a hereditary relationship with the gods themselves. We now know this. And certainly with royal women, they held considerable power. You can see representations here of a royal woman here discussing something with a man, and you can certainly tell who's in charge. It's the person on the left. I'm just kidding. And over there is a representation of probably the Maya ideal of feminine beauty, the young moon goddess. Next. Again, some things have stayed the same. You have ancient representations of weaving, which was a woman's task in general, was done on a backstrap loom, and it still is today. Very, very little has changed in the nature of Maya weaving. Cloth was extremely important in the pre-Columbian world. Next. Some other things don't change very much either. There's a number of representations of the young moon goddess and we call him the dirty old man. It's one of several of the old deities. You can see old god El over on the right fooling around with the young moon goddess, and the same theme here in this piece that I believe is in the Dumbarton Oaks collection, but there's a number of such representations. These are glimpses both of their conception of the relationships between these deified forces of nature on the right, and in some sense we're getting a glimpse of elite Maya life during the classic period. Next. At Palenque, a famous Maya site in Mexico, we have the example of the investiture of the famous Lord Pacal, an extremely powerful ruler. It's the man that you see pictured here in what's called the Oval Palace tablet. And he is being given the emblems of rulership from his mother, Lady Sakuk. We know who these people are, we can recognize them, and the glyphic inscriptions here are readable. Both of their names are on these inscriptions. This is Lady Sakuk, which means Lady White Quetzal Bird, and this is Lord Pacal's name of Palenque. This is the Palenque emblem glyph. So it's readable. We know who these people are, and we understand something about the power that women had in many cases to pass along the emblems of office in the royal lineage. Next. To show you the same scene of what's left on the right of the bench throne of Lord Pacal, again a 7th century Maya ruler of Palenque, and the Oval Palace tablet which sat behind him. Here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like, probably a very good reconstruction by Merle Green Robertson of San Francisco, showing a glimpse at classic Maya life. Okay, next. Now, some other facets, some of the rights and privileges of Maya rulership and authority. Bloodletting. For about the last 10 years, we've realized that one of the things that the Maya elite did, and perhaps everybody, we don't know on all levels because we don't know There's no record of what the average person did. But bloodletting was involved with this. That's actually a ceremonial replica of a Maya bloodletter. On the left here is with the little triple bow knot and that little face. It's the personified god of the bloodletter. Often it's a stingray spine, sometimes an obsidian lancet. And it was used for personal auto-sacrifice. Next. This is explicitly shown on vases like this famous Huehuetenango vase. Those Maya are lined up there on the top layer holding those bloodletters. It's called the penis perforator because we know that the royal males on certain occasions let blood by the perforation of their penises. Start thinking about this as something that your politicians might want to think about. Next. Not only is this described in the Chronicles, but it's pictured quite explicitly on Maya figurines, like the ones that you see in front of you here. The blood was we believe, put on paper, and that the paper was then burned and transformed into a smoke offering which went up to the gods. I'm going to show you the consequence of this. Why the bloodletting? There's a number of possibilities, but we now know, and again, it's because of the decipherment of the inscriptions, that the blood contained their essence, something called the chulel, a spirit that resided in the blood, and it could be transformed and passed on to future generations. When they converted it into smoke, the smoke contained the chulel, if it was from the blood, or at least figuratively speaking, if it was from the smoke, the burning of a certain type of incense. Next. There are rites like this, pictured where people are wearing blood-spattered bindings. This fellow dancing here is being a whirling dervish with bloody costume and a great bloody sash that's swinging around attached to his guess what. And these again we're seeing something of some special elite Maya bloodletting and blood display rites. This is a long way from the old image of the Pacific, peaceful, contemplative Maya astronomer priests, the so-called Greeks of the New World. Actually, when you find out what the classical Greeks were really like, the Maya were very much like the Greeks of the New World, because the Greeks, of course, indulged in human sacrifice and were constantly fighting amongst each other, which ultimately did them in. Next. Here again is the famous lintel 2 from La Pasadita that shows the so-called scattering rites in a drawing here and in a photograph. Again, several people, including David Stewart and Linda Sheely, several others have been able to show that they are scattering blood after a specific bloodletting rite. Now again, if I had a pointer, I could show you the glyphs for this there, but we'll leave it at that. Next. Here you see a young individual on the left. This is the rollout here. There's the vase, drawing a cord through his tongue. This is another form of bloodletting. I didn't come here just to shock you folks, but I am trying to give you a view into what we can learn from Maya art and from their inscriptions. So unless they're portraying things that didn't happen and they're writing about things that didn't happen and leaving us actual bloodletters, because in the tombs, one of the standard things that you'll find next to a Maya lord is his stingray spine, often sitting right next to the groin. Interesting. Next. The women got to pull the cords through their tongues rather than penis perforation. The women didn't often indulge in penis perforation, but you can see that there was a certain kind of a parallel here. And this is a famous lintel 24 from the Maya site of Yaxchilan, where Lady Shok, who's the consort of Shield Jaguar of Yaxchilan. This is Shield Jaguar's name here. It's a bloodletting rite where she is pulling the cord through her tongue, and the bloody cord is going into a bowl of paper, blood-spotted paper there, and later, as I'll show you, this will be burned and produce a smoke offering. Next. This is it on the right, and it's called the Fish in Hand event. This is a little jade version of this glyph for this event, and you see that Lady Shock is holding the bowl in her hands, one of the bowls in her hands, and it has several types of blood letters sticking out of it. There's a bowl sitting on the bottom of that image, and rising out of it is a great coiled, double-headed serpent, actually. The serpent's mouth is open, and emerging from it is an ancestral figure, as a specific type of warrior holding a lance. Can you see that? Now, sometimes people, this is one of the things I learned as an astronomer, beginning to learn about art, is that it takes a long time to learn how to see. It sounds like one of those things that they tell you the first day in an art class. You must learn to see. And the Zen master slaps you around and sends you off for 10 years and see if you can come back and whether you've learned to see. I'm still learning to see in this business, and it is exciting, and it's very personally rewarding to try to appreciate what they were trying to show us. But the interpretation of this so-called vision serpent is that it's the curl of smoke coming up from the offering itself and manifesting the chulel of the ancestor. Next. Which is pretty much what it says in that inscription. Let's go on to warfare. What do we know about the Maya and their relationships with each other? I think I've said, I'll say it again. There was no Maya empire. There was no overlord who dominated the whole Maya territory. It was a system of separate city-states dominated by dynastic families who claimed their ancestry to the gods themselves. They're called emblem glyph families, and we now know that the title for this emblem glyph is that they are claiming that they are divine lords of a certain heraldic family. In other words, it's saying divine Habsburg lord or divine Stuart lord. And they were constantly intermarrying, fighting with each other, alliances, trade agreements, and somehow the brilliance of the Maya is that this system worked. One of my colleagues, Arthur Demarest, calls it pulsating galactic polities. And what he means by that is that you kind of picture all these like little lights out there getting brighter and dimmer, like one polity will expand, maybe gobble up its neighbor in a war or through a marriage alliance and dominate that for a while. But then they'll lose their fortune in 100 years or so, and another one will expand. And this system stayed quite stable for a long time until the end. Here we have some indications from their monuments that actually they're quite warlike. And again, if someone were talking to you 30 years ago, they would tell you how peaceful these people were. Those folks ignored the artistic record of these people because they are constantly showing military scenes. Young warriors with their pleated cotton armor, warriors with their soldiers standing all named and everything. Next. I love this vase. Look at the face of that haughty young warrior. He's just ready to go off to Saudi Arabia or wherever else he's heading for, and obviously there's the general over there. Next. I love this one too, because it's a figurine that shows a young warrior, and on the right, this is like Halloween or something, or Friday the 13th. He looks like the most ferocious character in the world, but once he's got his helmet off, he just looks like a buck private, or with his shaved head and his military haircut, because they had that same type of brush haircut for the young warriors. We know a lot about these people, again, from what they say and what they show us about themselves. And we know that their warrior elites were very much like, maybe you can think of in terms of the Plains Indians, that each one had a separate costume and was individually recognizable, not a uniform, and that combat was a very personal arrangement, one on another. In fact, it was usually considered to be very poor form to kill your enemy in combat. The ideal thing was to capture your enemy, take him back for later sacrifice. In fact, we have an Aztec example of how they formed a bond. It was actually a filial relationship. Can you imagine this? That you're contesting with another equal, and maybe you hit him with your spear or your big obsidian-bladed sword, your maquahuitl. You get him down, you grab him by your hair, and once you've got him, if he's still able, he says, You are my beloved father, to the captor. And the captor says, you are my beloved son. And they entered into a special relationship which carried on until the death of the sacrificial death of the captive. There's a point of honor. And if you want to think of a parallel to this, we don't have one, I don't think. But the Japanese samurai elite was very similar. And the ritual suicides, the seppuku and things, there's a very good parallel between the nature of these societies. Next. Again, the depictions of battle are ferocious, like in these Maya-style murals from Cacaxtla. I don't know if you can see this, but this poor bird warrior character here is down. He's been slashed. His intestines are falling out. It's not a good day. Next. All of this was presided over by the planet Venus, because in Mesoamerica and for the Maya, Venus was a god of warfare. And on the right, of course, in our Western civilization, in general, Venus, the goddess of Friday, by the way, is a female fertility deity. Ishtar or Astarta for the Babylonians, Inanna for the Sumerians, Venus, Aphrodite, Freya for the Teutonic tribes. It goes all through our tradition, but in Mesoamerica, it's this character here on the far left. Venus manifests in many forms, but one of them is as a god of war. And this character is called Plawis Kalpantayuktli, which means Lord of the House of Dawn. Venus is morning star, actually also Venus is evening star. Much of my own personal research is involved with the Venus almanacs, Venus symbolism, and a style of warfare that was actually timed according to the Venus calendar. Again, something that we don't have, although what's going on now in the Mideast, maybe we are running a war by the calendar. We'll see. Next, 2 slides. Many examples on vases and on monuments show a style of warfare that involves the planet Venus. I'm going to step away here. This glyph right here is a glyph that we know to be a glyph of warfare, but it has this thing here with the 2 dots in it is the glyph for the planet Venus. We call it the Star War event or the Venus War event, and we now know that they actually timed these battles and raids according to a Venus calendar. Next. Here's a very good example. On the right is lintel 41 from Yaxchilan, showing a well-known character named Bird Jaguar the Great, and he's standing there with his spear. And the text actually there has that Star Wars event or Venus War event, and tells who his captive is, someone that we call Jewel Skull, who's pictured over here. Again, I wish I had a pointer, but I'll just show you. This says here, on this date was Venus. Poor Jewel Skull. It says, captor of Jewel Skull, his captive Bird Jaguar is what the first 4 glyph blocks say over here. Here again is our friend Bird Jaguar of Yaxchilan, and here he has old Jewel Skull labeled here on his thigh as a captive. So we have now many examples where we can actually read the texts as to what's going on. Graphic depictions of warfare and capture. Next. Again, these are just some of the glyphs that we have that relate to these concepts. Next 2 slides. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Venus almanacs, again, are prominent in the surviving books. There must have been many of them. And they depict the aggressive activities of these Venus gods. Again, look at this skeletal Venus. He's an evening star deity that's in the process of beheading a bound captive. This is standard Venus activity and done according to the calendar. Okay. Next. This is the end result, and again, this is the end of a Venus war. It's specifically labeled with a stack of 4 Venus glyphs there and 4 Venus warriors and 1 captive here. The only time that the Maya ever show nudity is to embarrass captives. So you can see the nude, bound prisoner being carried along by these 4 Venus warriors here. This is a rollout of that Maya vessel over there, done with a special type of camera. By a friend of mine, Justin Kerr, who invented this thing with a record player turntable The vase goes around, and a camera with a motorback drive, so the film drives past a lens and a slit as the vase turns, and he produces these marvelous rollout photographs of Maya vases. It's an interesting technique. Next. So again, in Maya monuments, these are some fine tablets that show the Lord standing there and literally lording it over. On the right there, you see a series of bound captives down below the throne. These late classic lowland Maya certainly they're not modest about demonstrating their power in the display of their captives. Okay, next. The ball game. These people developed a rubber ball game that actually you find it all throughout Mesoamerica. There really is some indication that our games of basketball and soccer and football actually derive in part from the ancient Mesoamerican games. Rubber and rubber balls were a Native American concept, and these were first seen after the conquest when some teams were taken over to Europe for exhibition. The rubber ball game was not only a sport, it was also a cosmic contest that in a sense was reacting a famous myth, a myth of life and death, a myth of the back and forth motions of the planets, a myth that we have one version of that survived in a Quiche Maya legend called the Popol Vuh, a myth of the miraculous birth of two young men, the hero twins, and ultimately learning that they are ball players rather than farmers, and the trip that they take into the underworld, dominated by the lords of death, the 9 lords of the underworld. They go there and go through a series of trials and play the ball game for their lives. And in that myth, they triumph over the lords of death. They trick them at their own game, at the game of death and sacrifice, and become transcendent beings. They become celestial beings. In the Popol Vuh, it's the sun and moon. And this metaphor of the cycle of time, of life and death, and playing the game of death in the form of this ball game with the lords of the underworld is something the Maya gloried in, and it's depicted in much of their art. These are a ball player on the right and a ball player in the posture of playing the game with this heavy rubber ball. Next. It's the metaphor again for the ultimate journey that one takes. It was played in a capital I-shaped court. Sometimes the ends were open, as in the case of Uxmal here. Sometimes one end was closed off in the I shape there, as you see at Copan, the famous court at Copan. Next 2 slides. This is the largest surviving Maya ball court from Chichen Itza in northern Yucatan. It's longer than a football field, has 2 huge rings up on the side. And the ball game that they played here was played for keeps, because one of the recent discoveries is that the ball game could serve as yet another form of gladiatorial sacrifice, an honorable way to die for a battle captive. There are a number of different types of gladiatorial sacrifices where a captive could fight for his life, and the ball game represented an entrance into the underworld and the great game of the underworld of life and death. Next. Recently, as part of the National Geographic article project I worked on, we arranged to have one of the last surviving teams of native ball players playing the game of Ulama. They're from near Culiacan in Sinaloa. And the teams are playing with the rubber ball. This is not a modern recreation. These are just some guys still playing the game as they have played it for centuries. And we took them for the first time to an ancient ball court. This is the one at Xochicalco in the highlands of Morelos. Actually, we took them there on the equinox to play this game as with the setting sun on the east-west line of this ball court. And photographer Bob Sasha got some extraordinary pictures, just to show you how this game was played, not using the hands, but with the hips and other lower parts of the body. Next. At Chichen Itza, On the ball court, freezes. They show you some aspects of the game. Don't try to match these two directly. There are 6 surviving freezes. The drawing doesn't correspond exactly with that freeze. They're all slightly different. But they show 2 teams, actually, with 7 guys on each team. And they're posing for their portraits at the end of the game. And the captain of the winning team here on the left is standing, holding the decapitated head of the loser. The loser is kneeling over there. His head is missing, and there are 7 serpents, actually 6 serpents and a morning glory vine probably, sprouting from his neck. The ball itself is a skull, and the emblem of this cult. In some sense, the ball and the human head were metaphors for each other. So, decapitation was the method of sacrifice of choice for the ancient Mesoamerican ball game. Next. And afterwards at Chichen Itza, what they did was they took the heads and stuck them on wooden pikes on a great wooden rack. In Nahuatl, it's called a tzompantli. And this is the stone version of this. This had a huge wooden construction on the top that had these heads. So all of this is involved with their perception of the necessity of sacrifice to perpetuate life, the giving and taking of life. We have an analog from the Aztecs also that I think is worth considering. And the Aztecs literally thought that because the gods had sacrificed themselves to create man after the destruction of the last world, because they believe in a cyclical creations and destructions of the world, because the gods sacrificed themselves and performed blood sacrifice, forever after, man then owed it back to the gods through their own blood to keep the universe running. I think this is a very fundamental idea. The Aztec name was Tlamasewalistli, which literally means you owe it to the gods. Next. The Maya underworld was a watery place. It was a place called Xibalba, a dank, dark, cave-like underworld. Most of the Maya territory is limestone and filled with numerous caves, and lots of low, watery areas along the coast and in the central lowlands. And water birds populated this area, and again, their agricultural system was tied to this kind of bajo or lowland agriculture. And they felt that after their lives, they had to go on a journey into this watery realm populated by a diversity of really quite nasty characters and go through a series of trials. Next. This is just, on the right, is just, one of these sort of fish, is a fish monkey monster character who's, just one of the denizens of this watery underworld. And they felt, in some cases, that they took a boat ride and the boat trip into the underworld, just like crossing the river Styx, I suppose. Here's like a great dragon boat that's pictured on this eccentric flint, with the young lord riding on down into the underworld. There are explicit representations of this boat, and the 2 gods who are the paddlers, who take them into this journey. We actually think it represents a river that went into a cave. In fact, rivers that go into and out of caves are quite common in the Maya realm. Next. This is one of the finest surviving Maya vases. In the literature, it's often called the Black Vase. It's a central lowland Maya vase, and it is luminous in the quality of its painting. And it shows a red-haired young lord, and they often show this young lord, and I'll be telling you, he's the personification of the first father, the corn god. This is like the growing of the maize and then the reaping and the dying of the maize. This red-haired, almost betasseled young lord who is riding on the nose of a great earth monster, and he's descending into a world populated by these 2 sacrificer deities, these characters who have those on their wristlets and on their anklets, those blood-spotted paper ties. Next. Here's another vase, probably by the same artist or from the same school. And again, it shows the young lord on the right in the underworld, about ready to be sacrificed by these 2 sacrificers. Next. Now, this is where I want to take just a few minutes to to tell you the legend of the Popol Vuh, just a very short version of it in this context, because it involves the first fathers named Hun Hunahpu and Vukub Hunahpu. This is in the Quiche Maya language. These were two brothers who went to the realm of Xibalba to play the ball game with the Lords of Death, and they lost and were decapitated. This picture on the left shows a decapitated head here with the blood flowing out of the neck. By the way, it's presided over by Venus. On the lid of that vessel is the Venus glyph. And next slide. The Lords of Death took the head of Hun Hunahpu and placed it in a tree. And eventually the flesh rotted and it just became a skull hanging in a tree. Next slides. Didn't have a picture of this delightful young lady. I would have to take one of the three on the right. But the daughter of Lord Blood, whose name is Kuchumakik, his daughter, whose name was Little Blood, Shkik, went to the tree and saw the head hanging in the tree. And the skull hanging in the tree spoke to her and said that he had wondrous things to tell her. But was she sure she wanted to know what he had to say? And she said, yes, I want to know what you have to say. And he said, hold out your hand. So Shkik, the young maiden, held out her hand, and the skull spit, and she caught that in her hand and was miraculously impregnated with the hero twins, these two young men. Their names are Hunahpu and Xbalanque. These are hero twin myths across the Americas. Miraculous conception of the hero twins. Well, old Lord Blood, Kuchumakik, finds out about this, that his daughter is pregnant in this unorthodox manner. He's wondering who the father was. She says, well, there was no father. I mean, I did not know any man. I did not know the face of a man, is what she said. And he didn't believe her, so he arranged to have her sacrificed. And he called his owls, these sacrificer owls, to take her away. And they took her away. But they took pity on her. She said, I didn't do it. And instead, they went to a special type of tree, and with a flint blade cut the tree and took its sap, sweet-smelling sap. We know this is the copal tree, from which their special incense called copal or palm was formed. And they made a heart out of this sap and took it back to Lord Blood and said, well, we've done it. Here's the heart of your daughter. And they put it in the fire, and they burned it, and the smell of it was so sweet they just danced around, because these are the Lords of Death. They love death and the smell of death, and this was wonderful. If this reminds you a little bit of Abraham and Isaac, it should, because this was the transformation of human sacrifice, in this case, to the use of this incense, which they still use today. Next. The two hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, then are born in our world. And at first they're corn farmers, and they grow miraculous cornfields. They're just excellent farmers. But eventually they find out that they are not really destined to be corn farmers, that they are ball players, and that their destiny is to go into the underworld, into Xibalba, and avenge their father's death and play the game. And they do this. Next slides. Trying to remember what I have next. They actually go to the next two slides. They go into the underworld. They pass through a series of trials: the House of Knives, the House of the Killer Bats, the House of Cold. And one of their trials is that they have to stay, they're given cigars to smoke, and they have to smoke the cigars all night long. And if the cigars go out, they're going to be executed the next morning. So they get fireflies to come and sit on the edge of their cigars, on the end of their cigars. So the Lords of Death sit there watching them all night, and they're still smoking their cigars, you know. And in the morning, the cigars are still there, unsmoked, and it's a miracle, and so they pass to the next trial. They make it through all the trials, and actually those are representations of these two hero twins on a Maya vessel over there, the two so-called headband twins in that rollout. And this is one of the Lords of Death. Next. Eventually, they reach that final place in the lowest portion of Xibalba. It's called Dusty Court. It's the old ball court where you play for your life. And they do. They play the ball game with the Lords of Death. And they have some tough moments. I mean, there's one of them loses his head, but he manages to get it back by magic. There's lots of parts of this story. But eventually, they win the ball game, and they put on a magic show. Next. This is described in the Popol Vuh, how there's Hunahpu on the left with an axe in his hand, a personified axe. And there's the little jaguar, Xbalanque, there. And the Lord of Death over on the right. This is the famous Metropolitan vase in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They sacrifice each other. They perform decapitations and all sorts of events that the Lords of Death just love. Next. In fact, some of these are shown on Maya vessels. They perform acts on the right there of auto-decapitation. Don't try this. I mean, if you ever get down, it's really very, very difficult. But it's depicted on Maya vases, and this just thrilled the Lords of Death. And they became so excited with these rites of death, next, that they say to the hero twins, well, do this to us too. We want to be sacrificed and brought back to life also. And so the young lords, they, like in this case, drag one of the Lords of Death out of his shell with their knife in hand, and they sacrifice the Lords of Death, but do not bring them back to life. They beat the game, and they rise up to heaven, and in the Popol Vuh they become the sun and the moon. And this is their legend of what every Maya lord and lady had to look forward to after they died. And we can see that they placed things in their tombs for them to make this perilous journey. Next. Last couple of slides here. I've been watching my time, and I've been talking to you for just a little bit under an hour. I have about 6 slides here, 5 or 6 slides of the greatest burial, the greatest tomb ever found among the Maya. And again, we'll see. I think I'll show you this quickly and then draw some conclusions, and if there's time for questions, that will be fine. This is the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, and it's the tomb of Lord Pakal of Palenque. We actually know this man's name. It was Pakal, which means shield. It's written out phonetically. He was born in 603 A.D., died in 683, just a little over 80 years old, and he became king in 618 at 15 years old and ruled for the rest of his life. He's buried inside of this Temple of the Inscriptions, which actually has a stairway that descends into the pyramid, and then down slightly below ground is a huge crypt and a sarcophagus. Next. This is what that stairway looks like, going down inside of the pyramid at a 45-degree angle, and there is Merle Robertson's reconstruction of, that shows you the scale of the crypt below ground, and the huge stone sarcophagus, and maybe some of the rites of passage that took place at the interment of Lord Pakal, who had all of this prepared for him before his death, ready for him to enter. Next. On the left is an artist's conception of Pakal laid out with his jade death mask in his tomb. He was just slightly over 6 feet tall. Again, a man of 80 years old when he died. That's an artist's mock-up of his tomb with the huge sarcophagus lid slid back over there on the right. Next. That's his jade death mask on the right, actually reconstructed. And on the left is a portrait of Lord Pakal. And in my opinion, it is one of the finest surviving portrait sculptures of ancient America, certainly one of the finest Maya portrait sculptures. It is the young Lord Pakal, and it was a stucco head that on his death was broken off a wall. It came out as a bust from the wall and was placed alongside of his sarcophagus in his tomb. Next. And this is his fantastic sarcophagus lid, and the size of it is from approximately almost the width of this stage, at least from me over to the wall, and about this thick. And it shows a transcendent theme of, again, you've probably already figured this out. I could talk about this for an hour if I had the time, but I won't. You're seeing Lord Pakal himself in a reclining position, sitting on the head of a god who is a version of the sun god. The lower part of that head is skeletal, the upper part is fleshed. He is falling with the setting sun into the open jaws of the earth monster. He is literally entering the jaws of death. And behind him rises a tree, and the tree actually says Divine Sun on the stem of the tree. And in some sense, it's a miraculous corn plant. It's the death and transfiguration of Lord Pakal, with the dying sun in the west taking his underworld journey and rising again in the east to become new life. Next. And so the cycle continues. Today, the Maya people are still with us, but they no longer know about their ancient calendar. I mean, they keep a small portion of it. In the highlands of Guatemala, they still keep the 260-day calendar. But these large periods of time in grand conceptions have been lost and have only been rediscovered in the last century and a half by modern scholarship. And it's one of these things that I would like to at least make a contribution to giving back to these people some conception of their calendar. I think the last two slides. I'll leave these on as I make a final summary here. What happened to them? What do we know about what happened to them? Because within a span of, about 60 years, they stopped building their buildings. They stopped erecting these monuments to time and to their rulers. They abandoned the central lowland sites, and within a short time, the jungle grew over them and just completely swallowed them up. The population dropped down. Was it a peasant revolt? Was it climate change? What did happen to them? Even 15 years ago, we didn't have very much of an idea, but today we do. And much of the evidence is coming from some very good archaeological projects, particularly at Copan in Honduras. We're finding out that, like so many successful systems, successful growth systems tend to overdo it. Think of any type of successful growth system that you know about. Once you discover the key, overpopulation, overuse of the landscape. We know that the Maya virtually cut down those jungles. Again, you show someone a photograph of Tikal or these places and you think, wow, these people lived with these cities surrounded by jungle. Well, they did in the beginning, but they cut down most of those jungles. And they overused their land and they overpopulated. The new evidence is showing that in the last centuries, couple of centuries before the end, people were not very healthy. And many problems were developing simply with nutrition because of the number of people. And the pollution, the silting up of their bajos. The evidence is that they literally were living on the edge of the carrying capacity of their environment. And we don't know the exact trigger, whether it was a political crisis or whether it was a climatic change, but in some sense it wouldn't have mattered because population cannot grow exponentially without hitting the wall in a finite environment. One of my favorite analogies is the bottle of wine. And I think I told a couple of you this thing a few weeks ago, but that's what happens in a bottle of wine. It's a finite environment. It's a wonderful, rich medium of sugar. You put in these yeast characters, and they go wild, and they overpopulate, and you can imagine some yeast right near the end of it saying, hey, this is the scientist yeast, I suppose. We've got to get out of here. This isn't good. There's a cork up there. Perhaps we can launch a satellite and bore our way out. But they don't usually do that. And when the alcohol level, which is their waste product, reaches a certain level, they all die. We cork them up and we drink a toast to them. I mean, that's a successful growth system. And this is what did happen to them. And because it's not like the fall of the Roman Empire, because their environment is so unforgiving, it took them 1,000 years to get their system together in the jungles there. And when it fell, the jungle grew over quickly, and it would take them, again, a long time to establish the same kind of relationship with the landscape and start all over again, and it just hasn't happened. So I think from my point of view, just to sum up, we are just about to enter the last 20-year period of the Great Maya calendar. At the end of it, in just about December 23rd, 2012, they would have expected the world to come to an end. They would have, the edginess of the Maya priests entering the last Katun on April 9th, 1993 would have been tremendous. They would have been dealing with the god of the last Katun of their calendar. And they would have expected something quite remarkable to happen at the end of it. Now, I'm not a mystic in the sense that I don't know what's going to happen in 2012. But I think this all serves as a suggestion that we might actually try to learn from history and learn about the problems of being too successful without thinking about the limits of growth within a finite environment. I see ourselves as doing the same thing in our own way that they did it, except our bottle is the planet Earth. And so without doing any more preaching, I'll leave you with this. I thank you very much.